I don't even know where to start. My hands are shaking, just thinking about it. I've always been skeptical of the supernatural, ghosts, hauntings, all that stuff. But now I don't know what to believe anymore. What I do know is that something is wrong with Highway 99. It happened about 3 months ago. I was driving back from a work trip in Oregon, heading south through California. The company had rented me a nice car, and I figured I'd drive through the night to make it back home early. The stretch of Highway 99 I was on was eerily quiet. Just long, empty roads with the occasional distant glow of a gas station. I've done my fair share of late-night drives, but there was something about that road that made my stomach twist. The first strange thing happened around 1 a.m. I saw a figure on the side of the road, a woman, standing completely still. She was in this old-fashioned, tattered white dress, and her long dark hair was tangled like she hadn't combed it in years. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, and I swear she was looking right at me as I passed. I'm not the kind of guy who stops for hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of the night, but something about her made me glance in my rearview mirror. She was gone. Just gone. No way she could have moved that quickly. My skin prickled all over, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. I turned up the radio and tried to focus on the road. Not even 5 minutes later, my dashboard lights started flickering. First, it was the radio cutting in and out, then the headlights dimmed and came back on. I checked my phone to see if I had a signal. Nothing. That's when I noticed the temperature inside the car. It felt like the air conditioning had suddenly gone haywire, blowing icy cold air even though I hadn't touched the settings. I shook my head and muttered, "It's just a car glitch. Nothing to freak out about." But then, I saw her again. She was in the middle of the road this time, standing as still as before, her head tilted, those dark, empty eyes staring straight into mine. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop just feet away from her. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. And then she was gone. Not like she ran off or moved. She just vanished. 1 second she was there, and the next, there was nothing but the empty road. I sat there in the car, shaking, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I felt it. The car shifted slightly, like someone was climbing into the back seat. My chest tightened. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to keep my eyes on the road and just drive. But curiosity got the better of me. I turned my head, and there she was. She was sitting in the back seat, her pale face inches from mine, her lips twisted into this horrifying grin that stretched way too far. Her eyes weren't just dark, they were empty, like hollow black pits. I screamed and jumped out of the car so fast I nearly tripped. Standing on the side of the highway, I fumbled for my phone, praying I'd somehow regained a signal. Still nothing. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps, and my heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. And then I heard it. A soft, low whisper. "Run." The voice didn't come from the car. It came from behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the empty stretch of highway under the dim glow of the moonlight. The whisper came again. Louder this time. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, running down the highway like my life depended on it. The rental car was still sitting there, headlights cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a faint light in the distance. A truck stop. I don't think I've ever been so relieved in my life. I stumbled inside, gasping for breath, and tried to explain what had happened to the guy behind the counter. He was this older guy, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and tired eyes. At first, he looked at me like I was crazy, but then something changed. His expression shifted from confusion to fear. "You saw her?" he said quietly. I froze. "You know about her?" The man nodded slowly. "They call her the Lady of 99. She's been haunting this stretch of road for decades. Folks say she was killed in a car accident back in the 1950s, a hit and run. Never got justice. They buried her in a cemetery not far from here, but her spirit, it never left." I stared at him, my mind racing. What does she want? "No one knows for sure," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're lucky you got away. Most people who see her, they don't make it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happens to them?" He didn't answer. He just shook his head and handed me a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. "You should count yourself lucky, son. Don't ever drive this highway at night again." I stayed at the truck stop until morning, too scared to go back to the car. When the sun finally came up, I found a tow truck to retrieve the rental. The mechanic said the car's electrical system had completely shorted out. He asked me if I'd driven through a flood or something. I just shook my head and told him I didn't know what had happened. I've taken a lot of trips since then, but I avoid Highway 99 like the plague. I don't care if it adds hours to my drive. I'll never set foot on that road again, especially not at night. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone in the car, I still feel like someone's watching me. I'll glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat with that twisted grin on her face. I don't know if she's still out there, waiting for her next victim, but if you ever find yourself on Highway 99 after dark, don't stop. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't let her into your car.
Story number 2.
I'll never forget the night I drove through the desolate stretch of Highway 61. They call it the Devil's Highway for a reason. I'd always thought those stories were nothing more than urban legends. That is, until I became part of one. It was late October, and the air had that crisp, eerie stillness. I was driving home to Mississippi after visiting family in Louisiana. The trip should have been uneventful, but my GPS rerouted me onto a long, empty stretch of Highway 61 after an accident blocked the main route. It was the dead of night, close to midnight, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. The road was poorly lit, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to press in on either side. My headlights barely penetrated the suffocating darkness, and every crack of a branch or rustle in the trees made my skin crawl. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. A pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, approaching fast. Relief flooded through me, finally another car. But as the vehicle got closer, something about it felt off. It was an old truck, the kind you'd expect to see in a vintage movie, but its headlights seemed unnaturally bright, almost blinding. The truck roared up behind me, so close I thought it might rear-end me. I gripped the wheel tightly, heart pounding. I slowed down to let it pass, but it didn't. Instead, it swerved side to side as if trying to force me off the road. I honked and flashed my brights, but it didn't back off. My panic grew as I pressed the gas, trying to outrun it, and then, just like that, the truck vanished. I mean, gone. 1 second, it was there, and the next, the road behind me was pitch black again. I blinked, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I hallucinating? Overtired? No, I was wide awake, and my hands were trembling on the wheel. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural laugh echoing from somewhere inside the car. I froze. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more menacing. It didn't sound human. It was deep, guttural, almost animalistic. I frantically checked my rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. The sound wasn't coming from inside the car, but it was all around me, surrounding me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. A figure standing in the middle of the road up ahead. She was draped in a black shroud, her face obscured by a veil. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt just inches from where she stood. But she didn't move. She just stood there, motionless, her head tilted slightly as if studying me. My heart was hammering in my chest as I fumbled to put the car in reverse, but before I could shift gears, she vanished. One blink and she was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. My breathing was shallow, and I kept glancing around, expecting her to reappear. Then, from behind me, I heard the sound of gravel crunching underfoot. I spun around, but no one was there. The air inside the car grew impossibly cold, and my breath fogged up the windshield. The radio crackled to life, even though I'd turned it off hours ago. A haunting voice filled the car, whispering something unintelligible at first. But then, it became clearer, a single phrase repeated over and over, "Turn around." I was frozen, too terrified to obey. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Turn around!" Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned, and there she was. She was sitting in the passenger seat, her veil pulled back to reveal a face so horrifying it defied explanation. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her skull, her hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as she leaned closer to me. "Why didn't you stop?" she hissed, her voice echoing like 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other. I screamed and threw the car into drive, flooring the gas pedal. The car roared forward, and I kept my eyes fixed on the road, too afraid to look anywhere else. I could feel her presence beside me, hear her raspy breaths, but I didn't dare glance her way. The car's headlights flickered wildly, the radio blasted static, and the steering wheel seemed to fight against me. It felt like the entire vehicle was being pulled in different directions, as if she were trying to drag me off the road. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The headlights stabilized, the radio cut out, and the oppressive cold lifted. I glanced at the passenger seat. She was gone. I drove like a madman, barely slowing down for curves and turns until I finally reached a gas station at the edge of the highway. I stumbled out of the car, shaking uncontrollably, and ran inside. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, took one look at me and frowned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed bitterly, the sound coming out more like a sob. "I think I did." Her face paled. "You were on Highway 61, weren't you?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. She sighed and crossed herself. "You're lucky you made it out. That road's cursed, you know. There have been stories about it for years. Phantom trucks, shadowy figures, even people disappearing without a trace. Locals say the spirits of those who died in accidents there never moved on." I stared at her, my throat dry. "Why doesn't anyone do something about it? Warn people?" She shook her head sadly. "We try, but some folks don't believe until it's too late. You're one of the lucky ones." I spent the rest of the night at that gas station, too scared to get back in the car. When the sun finally rose, I finished the drive home, avoiding every back road and shortcut. To this day, I refuse to drive Highway 61. And if you're ever in that part of the country, take my advice. Stick to the main roads. Because out there in the darkness, something is waiting, and it doesn't want you to leave.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a quick detour, just a few extra minutes off the main highway to avoid a nasty traffic jam. I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains late at night, heading home from a weekend trip with friends. The GPS suggested an alternate route, and without thinking much of it, I took the exit. That was my first mistake. The road was narrow, winding through thick woods that seemed to go on forever. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The deeper I drove, the more isolated I felt. There were no streetlights, no signs, no other cars. Just me, my headlights, and the suffocating darkness. About 15 minutes into the detour, I noticed something strange. The road signs were old. Not just old, but ancient looking, their paint faded and peeling, some barely legible. One in particular caught my eye, a wooden sign that simply said, "Cold Hollow." I didn't think much of it at the time, but the name stuck with me. As I continued, the road seemed to narrow even more, almost as if it were closing in on me. My headlights caught glimpses of things on the side of the road, rusted-out cars, an abandoned gas station with shattered windows, a collapsed barn, all of it like it had been left to rot decades ago. And then I saw her. At first, I thought it was an animal, something small darting across the road in the distance. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman, standing in the middle of the road, her back to me. She was barefoot and wearing a pale, ragged dress that looked soaked as if she'd just climbed out of a river. Her long, matted hair hung down her back, and she stood completely still. I slowed the car to a crawl, my heart pounding. I rolled down the window slightly and called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She didn't even move. Something about her felt wrong. The air around her seemed heavier, colder. I decided not to get out of the car. Something in my gut screamed at me to stay inside. Instead, I slowly drove around her, giving her a wide berth. As my car passed, I glanced out the passenger window to get a better look at her face. She didn't have one. Her face was just gone. Smooth, featureless skin stretched where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. My stomach lurched, and I slammed on the gas, speeding away as fast as the winding road would let me. But it didn't matter. In my rearview mirror, I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road behind me. Only now, she was closer, her head tilted as if she were watching me. Though I couldn't explain how, without any eyes. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white, and pressed harder on the gas. The next few minutes were a blur of terror. No matter how fast I drove, she kept appearing in the mirror, closer each time. 1 second she'd be far back, the next she'd be at the edge of my taillights, then almost right behind the car. And then she wasn't in the mirror anymore. I felt the weight shift in the car, as if someone had climbed into the back seat. My chest tightened, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there she was, sitting in the back seat, her head tilted unnaturally to the side, that smooth, featureless face turned toward me. A low, humming sound filled the car, a noise that vibrated through my skull and made my teeth ache. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stare as her head slowly tilted further, almost upside down, her body contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Suddenly, the humming stopped, and a single word echoed through the car, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Stay. I snapped out of my trance, my survival instincts kicking in. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The car was eerily silent, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. When I turned around, she was gone. But the nightmare wasn't over. As I sat there trying to catch my breath, the radio crackled to life, even though it had been off the entire drive. Static filled the car, and then a voice broke through, distorted and broken, whispering my name. David. I froze. My blood turned to ice. How did it know my name? The voice spoke again, clearer this time, more insistent. Turn back, David. Turn back. Every instinct told me to listen, to get off that road and find another way home. But before I could move, the voice changed. It grew deeper, more guttural, filled with malice. You shouldn't have come here. The headlights flickered, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I frantically turned the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. The headlights flicked back on, illuminating the road ahead. She was there, standing just a few feet in front of the car, her head tilted, her arms outstretched as if beckoning me. Her face, or lack of it, was all I could focus on. I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I backed away. But no matter how far I reversed, the road ahead never changed. She was always there, standing in the same spot, waiting. I don't know how long I drove like that, in some endless loop of terror. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, closed my eyes, and screamed, "What do you want?" The silence that followed was deafening. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The road was different now. Wider, smoother, with new-looking signs pointing me back toward the highway. It was as if I'd driven out of a nightmare and into reality. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit truck stop miles down the road. I stumbled out of the car, shaking, and collapsed on a bench outside. A kind-looking trucker approached me, asking if I was okay. I told him what had happened, and his face grew serious. "Cold Hollow?" he asked, his voice low. "You shouldn't have gone there. Locals say it's cursed. People who take that road at night, well, let's just say not all of them come back." I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. To this day, I don't know what I saw on that road or how I made it out. But if you ever find yourself driving late at night and your GPS suggests a shortcut through Cold Hollow, don't take it, because something waits for you there. And if it finds you, it won't let you leave.
Story number 4.
I never believed in ghosts or the paranormal. To me, they were just stories people told to scare each other around a campfire. But after what happened to me on a lonely stretch of Highway 51, I've changed my mind. Something is out there, and I don't think it's human. It started on a rainy night in October. I was driving back from my cousin's wedding, heading south toward my hometown in Tennessee. The weather had taken a turn for the worse. Rain pounded the windshield, and the wipers barely kept up. The highway was nearly deserted, with only the occasional pair of headlights appearing in the opposite lane before vanishing into the darkness. About an hour into the drive, my GPS alerted me to a road closure ahead. I groaned and glanced at the screen, which suggested a detour. The alternate route was longer and wound through a more isolated part of the States, but I didn't have much choice. Reluctantly, I took the exit. The road was narrow and poorly maintained, with potholes that sent jolts through the car every few minutes. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. My high beams illuminated the wet asphalt, but the darkness beyond felt endless. After about 30 minutes, I saw it, the first sign that something was wrong. A lone figure was standing by the side of the road, salt-drenched from head to toe. He was wearing a tattered coat and holding what looked like an old rusted lantern. His head was bowed, the brim of his hat casting his face in shadow. I slowed down, unsure whether I should stop. As I got closer, the figure slowly turned his head to look at me. That's when I saw his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale and waterlogged, like it had been soaking in a swamp for days. His eyes were sunken, and his lips were torn and bloody. He raised the lantern, and for a split second I thought he was signaling for help. But then he grinned. It wasn't a normal grin. It was too wide, too unnatural, stretching impossibly far across his face. My stomach churned, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding past him without a second thought. In my rearview mirror, I saw him drop the lantern and start walking into the road, his arms outstretched toward my car. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back again. For the next few miles, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the rain had distorted what I saw. Maybe the man had been injured and my mind had exaggerated the details. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The second sign came not long after. My radio, which had been playing a static-filled country station, suddenly cut out. The car filled with silence, broken only by the steady thrum of rain against the roof. I reached over to fiddle with the dials, trying to find another station. That's when I heard it, a soft, wet whisper coming from the back seat. "Why didn't you stop?" My heart froze. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Slowly, I glanced at the rearview mirror. There was no one there. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. It had to be my imagination, right? I was tired, it was late, and the storm was playing tricks on my senses. That's what I told myself anyway. But then I saw the lantern. It was in the middle of the road, flickering faintly in the rain. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car came to a halt. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was the same rusted lantern the man had been holding earlier. And standing beside it was the man himself. This time he wasn't smiling. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle and his empty eyes seemed to bore into mine. I threw the car into reverse, my heart pounding as I backed away. But before I could turn around, the engine sputtered and died. No, I muttered, fumbling with the keys. The engine wouldn't start. The headlights dimmed, plunging the road into near total darkness. I could barely see him now, but I knew he was still there. The sound of heavy, wet footsteps echoed through the storm, growing louder as he approached. Desperation took over. I locked the doors and grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but the rain. Then, a single deafening bang on the driver's side window. I screamed, dropping my phone. He was right there, his face pressed against the glass, his grin returning. His hand, pale and bloated, slid slowly down the window, leaving streaks of water behind. I could hear him whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the key one more time. The engine roared to life. Without thinking, I slammed on the gas, the tires spinning before finally catching traction. The car shot forward, and I swerved around the lantern, narrowly avoiding it. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, his head tilted as he watched me drive away. His lantern flickered once, twice, and then went out. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about 20 miles away. I stumbled out of the car, soaked with sweat, and rushed inside. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked if I was okay. I told her about the man, about the lantern, about everything. Her face paled. "You were on the old hollow road, weren't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" She hesitated before speaking. "That road's been abandoned for years. There was an accident back in the 1940s. A logging truck overturned and a group of workers were killed. They say one of them, a man with a lantern, wanders the road at night, looking for someone to stop and help him. But no one who stops ever comes back." A chill ran down my spine. "But I didn't stop," she nodded slowly, "and that's why you're still here. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed at the gas station until sunrise, surrounded by the comforting hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of distant trucks pulling in and out. When the storm finally cleared, I got back on the highway and drove straight home, vowing never to take a shortcut again. To this day, I can't drive at night without thinking about that man, his unnatural grin, and the sound of his footsteps in the rain. And if you ever find yourself driving down a deserted road and see someone with a lantern, take my advice. Keep driving, because some roads aren't meant to be traveled.
Story number 5.
I'm not one to scare easily. Growing up in rural Kansas, I've heard all the ghost stories. Haunted barns, phantom trains, strange lights in the fields. They're just part of the culture, passed down over campfires and late-night drinks. But one night, driving through the Flint Hills, I learned that not all stories are just stories. It was late, well past midnight. I was returning home from a friend's wedding, eager to sleep off the exhaustion from the long day. The route I chose was familiar, a quiet 2-lane highway cutting through miles of rolling hills and endless prairie. On a normal night, it was serene, even beautiful. But that night, it was suffocatingly dark. The only sound was the hum of my car engine and the occasional rattle of loose gravel when the tires strayed too close to the shoulder. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the headlights barely seemed to penetrate the inky blackness. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the isolation was starting to creep under my skin. Then, far ahead, I saw it. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, a pair of faint, flickering lights bobbing in the distance. Relief washed over me. I wasn't alone out here after all. But as I got closer, I realized the lights weren't on the road. They were hovering in the field to my left, weaving in and out of the tall grass. Will-o'-the-wisps, I thought. That's what the locals called them, those ghostly lights that led travelers astray. I smiled nervously, telling myself it was just swamp gas or fireflies. But deep down, something felt off. The lights moved with purpose, too smooth and synchronized to be natural. I sped up, determined to leave them behind, but as I drove, the lights seemed to follow me, keeping pace with the car. My heart began to race as I glanced between the road and the strange orbs in the field. And then I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the road. I barely had time to hit the brakes, the tires screeching as I swerved to avoid her. The car skidded to a stop, and for a moment everything was silent except for the frantic pounding of my heart. She was still there, standing motionless in the red glow of my taillights. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with long, tangled hair and a dress that clung to her like it was soaked through. Her head was bowed and her arms hung limply at her sides. I rolled down the window slightly, my voice trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She didn't even move. Something about her sent a chill down my spine. Her stillness was unnatural, like a statue carved out of flesh. And her feet, they weren't touching the ground. She was hovering just inches above the asphalt. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. Slowly, she began to lift her head, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Her face was pale and lifeless, her eyes hollow black pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the lights in the field surged forward, rushing toward the car. They weren't orbs. They were figures, shadowy and indistinct, but unmistakably human. Their movements were jerky, almost glitchy, as they clawed their way toward the road. I slammed the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I tried to get away. The woman's face twisted into a grotesque grin, her jaw unhinging far wider than it should have. A low, guttural noise, half laugh, half growl, filled the air as the figures closed in. I floored the gas, the car lurching backward before I threw it into drive and tore past her. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing there, her arms outstretched, the shadows swarming around her like moths to a flame. The sound of static filled the car, coming from the radio even though it was off. "Don't leave." The voice crackled through the speakers, soft and pleading. I pressed harder on the gas, the road a blur as I tried to put as much distance between me and that nightmare as possible. But no matter how far I drove, the voice persisted, growing louder and more distorted. "Stay with us, forever." The dashboard lights flickered and the car began to shake. My hands were slick with sweat, my breaths coming in short gasps. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The static, the shaking, the voice, it was all gone. The road stretched out before me, empty and quiet. The lights in the field had disappeared and the woman was nowhere to be seen. But the dread lingered, a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest. I didn't slow down until I reached a small diner on the outskirts of the next town. I stumbled inside, shaking and pale, and collapsed into a booth. The waitress, a kind older woman, brought me a cup of coffee and asked if I was okay. I told her what had happened, expecting her to laugh it off or call me crazy. But she didn't. Instead, her face grew serious, and she nodded slowly. "You saw the Lady of the Hills," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been haunting that stretch of road for as long as anyone can remember. They say she was a bride killed in a car crash on her wedding night. Those lights you saw? Those are the others, people who didn't get away. She lures them off the road, and they're never seen again." I stared at her, my hands trembling around the mug. "Why would she let me go?" The waitress shrugged. "Maybe she didn't. Maybe she's just waiting." I left the diner as soon as the sun came up, sticking to the main highway the rest of the way home. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the woman and her shadowy followers were still out there waiting for me to return. And if you're ever driving through the Flint Hills at night, stick to the main roads. Because out there, in the darkness, she's waiting. And if she finds you, she won't let you leave.
Story number 6.
I was never one to shy away from long drives at night. There's something peaceful about the open road, the hum of the engine, and the stars overhead. But after what happened to me on Highway 43, I'll never drive alone at night again. It was late November, and I was driving from Chicago to visit my parents in Missouri. The route was familiar, one I'd taken countless times before, but that night felt different. The air was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how high you cranked the heat. The highway was eerily empty, and the vast stretches of farmland on either side seemed darker, almost oppressive. About 2 hours into the drive, my GPS suggested a shortcut. It wasn't unusual. It always tried to shave a few minutes off the trip. The alternate route was a quiet back road, straight and narrow, cutting through miles of farmland. I didn't think twice about it and took the turn. That was my first mistake. The road was desolate, lined with barbed wire fences and skeletal trees. My headlights barely lit the way ahead, and the reflective mile markers were few and far between. It felt like I was driving into a void. I tried to shake off the unease, blaming it on the cold and the isolation. Then I saw the first sign. It was an old wooden signpost on the side of the road, its paint faded and chipped. The words were barely legible, but I caught enough to read, "Welcome to Quiet Hollow." The name sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I'd never heard of Quiet Hollow, but something about it felt wrong. As I drove deeper into the area, the radio began to act up. Static crackled through the speakers, and the station I'd been listening to faded in and out. I reached to turn it off, but before I could, a faint voice cut through the static. "Turn back." I froze. The voice was soft, almost pleading, and definitely not part of the music. My stomach knotted, but I told myself it was just a glitch, some interference from a nearby tower. I turned off the radio, letting the silence calm my nerves, but the silence didn't last. A loud bang echoed from the rear of the car, like something heavy had hit the trunk. I swerved slightly, my heart racing, and pulled over to the side of the road. For a moment, I debated whether to get out and check. The rational part of me argued it was probably just a pothole or a piece of debris. But as I sat there, gripping the wheel, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense that I was being watched. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my phone and a flashlight and stepped out. The cold hit me like a slap, and the darkness was so thick it felt almost tangible. I shone the flashlight around, scanning the road and the surrounding fields. There was nothing, no damage to the car, no debris, nothing that could explain the noise. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the field beside the road. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The beam caught something moving in the tall grass, something low and fast. It was too dark to make out details, but whatever it was coming closer. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The rustling stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then a shadowy figure emerged from the grass, standing just at the edge of the flashlight's reach. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, wearing a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice trembling. He took a step forward, and that's when I saw it. His face. Or rather, the lack of it. His features were blurred, as if someone had smeared his face like wet paint. His eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to absorb the light. Panic took over. I scrambled back into the car, slamming the door and locking it. The figure didn't move, but I couldn't look away. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine. The car roared to life, and I floored it, speeding away from the figure. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I was safe. But he was there, sitting in the back seat. I screamed, swerving wildly as I tried to keep control of the car. The figure didn't move, didn't react. He just sat there, staring at me with those empty eyes. His presence filled the car with a suffocating cold, and the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone." He tilted his head, bright, almost curiously, and then he was gone. 1 second he was there, and the next the back seat was empty. But the cold lingered, and the air still felt wrong. I drove as fast as I could, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The road stretched on endlessly, the darkness pressing in on all sides. My GPS, which had been silent until now, suddenly recalculated. "Rerouting," it said in its calm, mechanical voice. "Turn left in 500 feet. I glanced at the screen, confused. There was no left turn, just more road and the barbed wire fences. But as I approached the supposed turn, the headlights illuminated something new. A gate. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. The The gate was old and rusted, hanging open to reveal a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. My GPS insisted I take it, repeating the instruction like a broken record. I didn't. Instead, I sped past, ignoring the GPS entirely. As I did, I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the gate swinging shut, though there was no wind. The rest of the drive was a blur. The strange feeling in the air didn't lift until I saw the familiar lights of a gas station on the horizon. I pulled in, shaking, and sat in the car for a long time before going inside. The attendant, a young guy with a bored expression, asked if I was okay. I told him about the man, about the GPS, about the gate. He frowned. Quiet Hollow? You drove through there? I nodded, confused. Yeah, why? His face paled. People around here don't take that road at night, not after what happened. What do you mean? I asked, dread creeping into my voice. He hesitated, then leaned closer. Years ago, there was an accident. A bus full of people went off the road near Quiet Hollow. They say the driver fell asleep, but some folks think it wasn't an accident. They say something lured the bus off the road. I stared at him, my blood running cold. And the man I saw? The attendant shook his head. They say the dead don't like being left alone out there. I didn't sleep that night, and I've never taken a shortcut again.
Story number 7.
The only thing I wanted was to get home. It had been a long day at work, and the thought of my warm bed was the only thing keeping me awake as I navigated the dark, winding roads. I live in a rural part of Pennsylvania, where the highways are surrounded by dense forests and small towns that seem to disappear after sunset. Normally, the drive is peaceful, even calming. But that night, something felt different. It started with the fog. One moment, the air was clear, and the next, I was enveloped in a thick, swirling mist. My high beams did little to cut through it, illuminating only a few feet of road ahead. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tightly, my pulse quickening. The fog seemed alive, creeping closer with every second, as if it wanted to swallow my car whole. Then I saw the sign. It was old and weathered, barely legible under the faint glow of my headlights. Deadwood Creek. It read, the paint peeling off the wooden surface. I didn't recognize the name, but I assumed I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. My GPS had lost signal miles ago, and my phone was useless in this dead zone. I told myself to stay calm. It was just a detour, and the road had to lead somewhere. Right? The further I drove, the stranger things became. The trees lining the road looked wrong, twisted and gnarled, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. I could swear they were closer to the road than they should have been, as if they'd moved while I wasn't looking. And then there was the sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind whistling through the trees, but as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a low, mournful wailing, rising and falling like a distant cry. My stomach knotted, and I pressed down on the gas, eager to leave whatever was making that noise far behind. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, her back to me. Her long, dark hair hung in matted strands, and her white dress was torn and stained. She was barefoot, her pale feet barely visible beneath the hem of her dress. I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. She didn't move, didn't turn to acknowledge my presence. I rolled down the window slightly, the cold air biting at my skin. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I called out. No response. I glanced around, searching for any sign of a broken-down car or a house nearby, but there was nothing. Just the endless fog and the oppressive darkness. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to drive away, but I couldn't leave her there. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, my voice trembling. Slowly she turned to face me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, God, her eyes were black, like two bottomless pits. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, and then she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, hollow, and wrong. I slammed the window shut and hit the gas, my tires spinning on the damp asphalt before the car lurched forward. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing there, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she watched me drive away. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then the car began to act up. The radio, which had been off, crackled to life, blasting static through the speakers. The dashboard lights flickered and the engine sputtered, threatening to stall. "No, no, no," I muttered, desperately trying to keep the car moving. The static on the radio shifted and I heard something, whispers. Dozens of them, overlapping and indistinct, like a chorus of voices speaking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was pleading, desperate. Then, through the static, I heard her voice. "Why didn't you stop?" I screamed, slamming the radio off, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, filling the car with their chilling presence. The air grew colder, my breath fogging up the inside of the windshield. The car suddenly skidded to a halt, as if something had grabbed hold of it. The engine died, and the headlights flickered out, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I tried to restart the car, but the engine refused to turn over. Then I saw them. Figures emerged from the fog, dozens of them, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. They surrounded the car, their faces hidden in the shadows. I could feel their eyes on me, could sense their anger, their pain. And among them, standing at the front, was the woman in white. She stepped closer, her movements unnaturally smooth, her feet never touching the ground. She raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Her mouth moved again, and this time I could hear her. "Stay with us." The car jolted violently, the windows fogging up as the temperature plummeted. I could hear them now, their hands scraping against the glass, their voices growing louder. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I closed my eyes and screamed, praying for it to stop, for the nightmare to end. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I opened my eyes. The figures were gone. The fog had lifted, revealing the familiar stretch of road leading back to the main highway. The car's engine roared to life, and the dashboard lights flickered back on. I didn't question it. I didn't stop to think. I just drove. When I finally made it home, I parked the car and stumbled inside, locking every door and window. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the house sending my heart racing. The next morning, I searched for Deadwood Creek, curious to see if it was a real place. What I found made my blood run cold. The area had been abandoned decades ago after a flood wiped out a small village. Many of the residents were never found, their bodies lost to the water and the woods. Locals claimed the spirits of the dead still haunted the area, luring travelers off the main roads and into the fog. I haven't driven that route since, and if you ever find yourself on a desolate highway and see a shortcut on your GPS, ignore it, because some roads aren't meant to be traveled.
Story number 8.
I didn't want to take the night shift. No one ever did, especially on Route 17. The stretch of highway had a reputation, one that most people dismissed as urban legend. Strange sightings, phantom vehicles, even disappearances. But stories don't pay the bills, and I needed the money. So when my boss offered me the extra hours driving freight that night, I reluctantly agreed. It was supposed to be a simple route, pick up a load from a distribution center and haul it across the state to a warehouse. I'd done it before. But this time, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper as I pulled out onto the empty highway. The first few hours passed without incident. The radio played softly in the background, and the steady hum of the engine was almost comforting. But as the clock inched past midnight, things began to change. The road, usually dotted with the occasional car or truck, was eerily deserted. Even the rest stops I passed were dark and lifeless, their parking lots empty. Then I saw the hitchhiker. He was standing on the shoulder, his thumb outstretched, illuminated by the glow of my headlights. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. Something about him made me hesitate. Hitchhikers weren't uncommon, but this guy, he felt off. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural, and his head was tilted at an odd angle, as if he were studying the road. I didn't stop. I wasn't about to pick up a stranger in the middle of nowhere, especially not at that hour. As I drove past, I glanced at him in the side mirror. That's when I realized he was staring directly at me. His head turned unnaturally far to follow my truck, and even as I sped up, his figure lingered in the mirror longer than it should have. I shook it off, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But a few miles later, I saw him again. Same spot, same pose, thumb out, head tilted. My stomach tightened. I was sure I hadn't turned around or doubled back. It was impossible for him to be ahead of me. This time, I didn't look in the mirror. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The air inside the cab felt colder, and a faint static buzzed through the radio. I reached out to adjust the dial, but the static only grew louder, morphing into something else, a low, guttural whisper. "Pick him up." The voice was barely audible, buried beneath the static, but it sent a chill down my spine. I switched the radio off, but the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, echoing in my head. I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was happening. Then the truck shuddered, the engine sputtered, and the lights flickered, plunging the road into darkness. I cursed under my breath, wrestling the wheel as the truck rolled to a stop. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to calm my nerves. The highway stretched out before me, empty and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cold night air biting at my skin. The engine compartment looked fine, but when I turned to inspect the trailer, I froze. He was there. The hitchhiker stood just a few feet away, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. But now I could see his eyes, two pale orbs that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there watching me. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" No response. I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Then, without warning, he smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide for a human face. His teeth were sharp, jagged, glinting in the dim light. That's when I ran. I scrambled back into the cab, slamming the door and locking it. My hands fumbled with the keys as I tried to restart the engine, but it refused to turn over. The headlights flickered on for a brief moment, and I saw him again, standing directly in front of the truck. "Pick me up?" he whispered, his voice echoing inside the cab, even though the windows were shut. I screamed, slamming my hand on the horn. The sound blared through the night, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his smile growing impossibly wider. The truck rocked violently, as if something massive had slammed into it from the side. The radio crackled back to life, the whispers turning into screams. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The lights came back on, the engine roared to life, and the road was empty. He was gone. I didn't question it. I floored the gas, speeding down the highway as fast as the truck would go. My hands were trembling, my breath shallow. I didn't stop until I reached the warehouse, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally made it home, I did some digging, desperate to make sense of what I'd experienced. That's when I stumbled across the story of the hitchhiker of Route 17. According to legend, he was a drifter who died in a hit-and-run decades ago. Drivers claim to see him on foggy nights, always hitching a ride. Those who stop, they're never seen again. I don't drive Route 17 anymore. And if you ever find yourself on that lonely stretch of highway, do yourself a favor. Don't stop.